Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel After Dark. Tonight we're drifting off into the history of two cities that celebrate the same holiday each year, separated by 500 miles of Gulf Coast highway, bayou, and brush country. Before we dive in, if you're looking for resources to help you relax and sleep better naturally, be sure to check out the link in the description below. Let's get started. Imagine two cities, separated by 500 miles of Gulf Coast highway, bayou, and brush country. One breathes the humid, heavy air of the Mississippi Delta, draped in iron lace and the ghost of 1,000 songs. The other rises from the dry limestone heart of South Texas, its river threading quietly through a downtown that still carries the memory of Mission bells. They seem, on the surface, like different worlds, but lean in close, and you begin to hear the same heartbeat. New Orleans and San Antonio are two of the most culturally layered cities in all of North America. They're cities where the past does not stay buried. It rises through the cobblestones, it floats in the music, it lingers in the food, and it lights up every year on the same sacred day. A day that both cities inherited from the same distant European world that shaped them, century by century, into everything they are today. To understand why these two cities share so much, you have to go back. All the way back to a time when this entire region was not the American South or the American Southwest, but something far older, far stranger, and far more layered. A contested frontier where French ambition, Spanish Empire, Catholic faith, indigenous survival, and African endurance collided and, somehow, alchemized into something entirely new. Let us begin where all good stories begin, at the beginning. The land that would become New Orleans had been home to indigenous peoples for thousands of years before any European ever set eyes on it. The Chitimacha, the Choctaw, the Natchez, these nations understood the Delta intimately. They knew its floods and its gifts. They built on its ridges, traded along its waterways, and developed a relationship with this shifting, restless landscape that would take European settlers generations to even begin to comprehend. The Choctaw people, in particular, would later become indispensable to the earliest colonial settlers, teaching them which high ground was stable enough to build on, which plants could heal, and how to navigate a world that refused to sit still. The French arrived in this region in the late 17th century, pushing south from Canada and moving down the spine of the continent along the great river the indigenous people called Mississippi, the Great River, what we now call the Mississippi. René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, claimed the entire Mississippi River basin for France in 1682, naming it Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. It was an audacious claim over an almost incomprehensibly vast territory, and France wasted little time trying to plant its flag in the soft Delta soil. The actual founding of New Orleans came in 1718, when the French colonial governor Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville chose a crescent-shaped bend in the lower Mississippi as the site for a new capital. He called it La Nouvelle-Orléans, naming it after Philippe II, the Duke of Orleans, who was then serving as regent of France. Bienville was not the first European to recognize the value of that particular bend in the river. Earlier explorers had noted it, but he was the one who committed to it, despite the very real concern that the land was low, swampy, and prone to flooding. The site was chosen not for comfort, but for strategic and commercial power. Whoever controlled the mouth of the Mississippi controlled the trade of an entire continent. Building a city on a swamp, however, is no simple matter. The earliest settlers, French soldiers, missionaries, engages who were essentially indentured laborers, and a complicated mix of transported prisoners and genuine volunteers, struggled enormously. The heat was punishing, the mosquitoes relentless, and the ground beneath them was less solid earth than accumulated centuries of river sediment. The colony nearly failed multiple times in its first decade. Disease swept through the population. Supplies from France were inconsistent and often insufficient, and yet the city survived. Part of that survival was owed to a demographic decision that would permanently shape the soul of New Orleans. Beginning in 1719, enslaved Africans were brought to Louisiana in significant numbers by the French Charter Company of the Indies. The majority came from the Senegambian region of West Africa, present-day Senegal and Mali, and they brought with them not just their labor, but their knowledge, their culture, their spiritual practices, and their extraordinary skill in cultivating rice in wet, difficult terrain. Without the agricultural expertise of enslaved Africans, the Louisiana colony's economy would have been far slower to develop. The French settlers were building on stolen land with stolen labor, and the city that rose from that dark foundation would be permanently, indelibly marked by the African cultures that were forced to help create it. Now, while the French were sinking their pilings into the Mississippi mud, something equally significant was happening nearly 500 miles to the west. The Spanish, who had been the dominant colonial power in Mexico and much of the Americas since the early 16th century, were anxious about the French presence in Louisiana. Spain already controlled an enormous arc of territory through what we now call the American Southwest, but the establishment of a French colony so close to their northern Mexican territories made Spanish authorities nervous. They needed to extend their presence northward to establish a buffer and to convert and control the indigenous populations of the region they called Tages. The result was a deliberate, mission-driven colonization of what is now Central Texas. Franciscan missionaries had actually been active in the area as early as the 1690s, but the establishment of a permanent settlement took root with the founding of Mission San Antonio de Valero in 1718, the very same year Bienville was laying out New Orleans. It is a striking coincidence, and more than a coincidence. Both cities were born from the same anxious energy of competing European empires, planted in the same year like two flags in the New World soil. The mission that would eventually become famous as the Alamo was, in its original purpose, not a military fortress at all. It was a Franciscan religious complex designed to serve as a center for converting the Coahuiltecan and other indigenous peoples of the region to Catholicism and, in the colonial understanding of the word, to civilize them, meaning to remake them in the image of Spanish Catholic culture. The mission system was simultaneously an instrument of faith and an instrument of empire. Priests genuinely believed they were saving souls. The Spanish crown understood the missions as the leading edge of territorial consolidation. For the indigenous peoples who entered them, the missions represented a world of coercion, epidemic disease, disruption of traditional life, and, sometimes, a fragile form of physical protection from other threats. The civilian settlement of San Antonio was formalized in 1731, when the Spanish crown sent a group of 15 Canary Island families, 56 people in total, to establish a proper civil government alongside the missions and a military presidio that had already been established nearby. These islanders, called Islenos, were granted noble status and given land, and they formed the nucleus of what became the Villa de San Fernando de Bejar. They brought with them their Canarian customs, their dialect, their devotion to particular saints, and their Mediterranean Catholic traditions. They were a small group, but their influence on the civic and cultural identity of early San Antonio was outsized, and their descendants can still be found in the city today. What strikes you? when you sit with the early histories of these two cities side by side, is how much of what we think of as quintessentially American about them is actually the layered residue of these colonial encounters. The French Quarter in New Orleans is called the French Quarter, and yet most of the architecture you see there today is not French at all. It is Spanish. After a catastrophic fire in 1788 and another in 1794 destroyed much of the original French colonial wooden architecture, the city was rebuilt during the period of Spanish rule in the more durable Spanish colonial style, with its characteristic interior courtyards, wrought iron balconies, and thick stucco walls. The Spanish rebuilt what the French had first imagined, and the result was something neither purely French nor purely Spanish, but distinctly New Orleanian. This is because New Orleans did not remain French for long. In 1762, by the secret Treaty of Fontainebleau, France quietly ceded Louisiana to Spain, though the transfer was not publicly announced until 1764, and the residents of New Orleans did not formally come under Spanish authority until 1769, when the Governor Alejandro O'Reilly, an Irish-born officer serving the Spanish crown, which tells you something about how tangled colonial identity could be, arrived with 2,000 troops and made Spanish rule unmistakably clear. The Creole population of New Orleans, who thought of themselves as French, was outraged. There was actually a brief rebellion against Spanish authority in 1768, led by a group of prominent colonists. O'Reilly suppressed it swiftly and executed the ringleaders, earning himself the enduring nickname Bloody O'Reilly in New Orleans legend. But over time, the Spanish period transformed New Orleans in ways that proved lasting. Spanish governance brought a more organized legal and administrative structure. The Spanish also introduced a practice called coartation, which allowed enslaved people to purchase their own freedom, and New Orleans developed one of the largest communities of free people of color, gens de couleur libres, in all of North America. This community, many of whom were mixed-race descendants of French colonists and enslaved African women, occupied a unique and complicated social position. They were not enslaved, but they were not equal to white Creoles either. They built their own institutions, their own churches, their own neighborhoods. They educated their children, sometimes in France. They became skilled artisans, musicians, and business people, and they contributed immeasurably to the cultural fabric of the city, to its architecture, its music, its cuisine, and its particular approach to beauty and pleasure and sorrow. In San Antonio, the Spanish colonial project was unfolding along its own distinctive lines. By the mid-18th century, the area around the San Antonio River had become home to 5 separate missions: Mission San Antonio de Valero, Mission Concepcion, Mission San Jose, Mission San Juan, and Mission Espada. A remarkable concentration of Franciscan religious architecture spread along a modest river in the South Texas brush country. These missions were not just churches. They were functioning communities, agricultural operations, craft workshops, housing complexes, and religious centers all in one. The indigenous people who lived and worked within them, whatever the coercions of that arrangement, also shaped those spaces and left their mark on the culture that grew there. The Catholic faith that both cities absorbed during this colonial period was not a monolith. It was a living, breathing thing that absorbed local influences, indigenous practices, African spiritual traditions, and European folk customs. In New Orleans, the Catholic faith blended with West African religious traditions, particularly those of the Yoruba and Fon peoples, to produce something that the wider world would come to know as voodoo, though the practice itself, known to practitioners as Vodou, is far more nuanced, far more dignified, and far more spiritually serious than the caricature that popular culture has made of it. The Catholic saints and the African Loa, spiritual entities, were mapped onto one another in ways that made theological sense to practitioners who were navigating two worlds simultaneously. This was not a corruption of Catholicism. It was a creative, survival-driven synthesis. In San Antonio, the Catholicism that took root was more uniformly drawn from Spanish and, eventually, Mexican traditions, shaped by the Franciscan missionaries and deepened by the waves of Mexican immigration that would define the city's character across centuries. The feast days, the devotion to the Virgin of Guadalupe, the elaborate celebration of holy days through processions and food and community gathering, all of this created a Catholic culture in San Antonio that was warm, communal, and profoundly tied to the rhythms of the liturgical calendar. And it is the liturgical calendar that finally brings these two cities together in the most visible and joyful way. Both New Orleans and San Antonio celebrate Fiesta, though they call it by different names and observe it through different traditions. In New Orleans, it is Mardi Gras. In San Antonio, it is simply Fiesta. But both celebrations are anchored to the same Catholic tradition, the movable feast of Easter and the days of preparation and release that surround it. Mardi Gras, literally Fat Tuesday in French, is the final day of Carnival, the season of feasting before the austere fasting period of Lent begins on Ash Wednesday. San Antonio's Fiesta, while not identically tied to the same date in the same way, shares the same spiritual and cultural DNA, a Catholic European tradition of communal celebration, of elaborate pageantry, of food and music and procession, inherited from the same colonial world that shaped both cities and that neither city has ever entirely let go. This is where the story truly begins, not with the moment of founding, but with the long, slow, joyful, painful, resilient process of becoming. Two cities planted in the same year, shaped by the same competing empires, soaked in the same Catholic traditions, and populated by extraordinarily diverse communities of people who refused to simply accept what colonial power gave them, but instead transformed it into something richer, stranger, and more beautiful than any crown or any church had originally intended. Over the next hours, we will follow these cities forward, through the transfer of Louisiana to the United States, through the Texas Revolution, through Civil War and Reconstruction, through the Great Migration, through the birth of jazz and the flowering of Tejano culture, all the way to the present day, where both cities continue to navigate the complicated, living legacy of everything that came before. But for now, close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine the sound of trumpet floating over the rooftops of the French Quarter on a warm February night. Imagine the smell of tamales and marigolds drifting through a San Antonio street on a bright spring afternoon. These are not merely pleasures. They are the accumulated memory of centuries, still alive, still breathing, still being made, in two of the most extraordinary cities the Americas have ever produced. By the time the 18th century drew to a close, both New Orleans and San Antonio had survived their uncertain, violent infancies and grown into something recognizable as cities. Imperfect, complicated, layered cities, but cities nonetheless, with their own rhythms, their own hierarchies, their own ways of making meaning out of the raw material of colonial life. And then, within just a few years of each other, both cities were shaken loose from the empires that had built them, cast into new political realities that neither their residents nor their new rulers were entirely prepared for. The story of how that happened, and what it meant, is one of the most consequential chapters in the history of North America. And to understand it fully, you have to understand something about the nature of empire itself. That empires are not permanent. that the same colonial powers who planted these cities like seeds in foreign soil would eventually lose their grip on them, and that the people who had been living inside those empires all along would be left to figure out what came next. In New Orleans, the Great Transformation came from an unexpected direction. Spain had held Louisiana since 1769, and for all the early resentment of Spanish rule, the colony had actually flourished under it. The port of New Orleans had grown into one of the most economically important in the hemisphere. The city's population had expanded, its architecture had been remade after the fires, and its social fabric had become breathtakingly complex. A layered world of French Creoles, Spanish officials, free people of color, enslaved Africans, Anglo-American traders drifting down from the north, and a growing population of refugees. Those refugees deserve particular attention, because their arrival reshaped New Orleans in ways that are still visible today. In the 1790s, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the western third of the island of Hispaniola, present-day Haiti, erupted in the largest and most successful slave rebellion in the history of the Americas. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791 and culminated in Haitian independence in 1804, sent waves of refugees fleeing to Cuba, and then, in 1809 and 1810, when Napoleon's invasion of Spain destabilized Cuba's relationship with its Spanish rulers, roughly 10,000 of those Saint-Domingue refugees poured into New Orleans in a single 2-year period. They came in 3 roughly equal groups: white Creoles, free people of color, and enslaved people, and they nearly doubled the city's population overnight. They brought with them their French language, their Caribbean Creole culture, their particular Catholic devotions, their music, their cooking, and the Vodou traditions that had animated the resistance of Saint-Domingue's enslaved population. New Orleans absorbed them, was transformed by them, and became something even more densely layered than it had been before. But before those refugees arrived, New Orleans had already undergone its most dramatic political transformation. In 1800, by the secret Treaty of San Ildefonso, Spain quietly retroceded Louisiana back to France. Napoleon Bonaparte had grand plans for a French empire in the Americas, with Louisiana serving as the agricultural breadbasket to feed a Caribbean empire anchored in Saint-Domingue. But the Haitian Revolution destroyed that dream. With Saint-Domingue lost, Louisiana's strategic value to Napoleon collapsed almost overnight. He needed money for his European wars far more than he needed a distant territory he could not adequately defend or exploit. And so, in 1803, Napoleon sold the entire Louisiana territory to the United States for approximately $15 million, roughly 3 cents an acre for some 828,000 square miles of land. President Thomas Jefferson, who had sent diplomats to Paris hoping to purchase only the city of New Orleans and a small surrounding area to secure American access to the port, received instead an offer for an entire continent. The Louisiana Purchase more than doubled the size of the United States in a single transaction, and it placed New Orleans, overnight, without a shot fired, inside the American Republic. The residents of New Orleans received this news with something considerably less than enthusiasm. The French Creoles, who had spent decades resisting Spanish authority, had no particular desire to become Americans either. They had their own language, their own legal system, the French and Spanish-derived civil law tradition, which Louisiana still uses today, and which makes it legally distinct from every other American state. Their own religion, their own food, their own music, and their own deeply felt sense of themselves as a people apart. William C.C. Claiborne, the young American governor sent to administer the new territory, wrote back to Washington in bewilderment and frustration about a population he found nearly impossible to govern according to the democratic, Protestant, Anglo-American norms he brought with him. New Orleans did not become American so much as it allowed America to wash over it while quietly remaining itself underneath. The tension between what New Orleans was and what the United States wanted it to become would define the city's next half-century. Anglo-American settlers poured into the city after 1803, drawn by its commercial power. They settled in new neighborhoods upriver from the original French Quarter. The area called the Garden District would eventually rise from this American influx, and they brought with them their own churches, their own banks, their own social clubs, and their own deep discomfort with the city's racial complexity. The free people of color who had occupied such a distinctive and relatively protected niche under French and Spanish colonial law found themselves increasingly squeezed as American racial categories, which admitted far less ambiguity than the Creole social order, began to impose themselves on the city's life. And yet the city's culture proved remarkably resilient. The food that was already developing in New Orleans kitchens, a cuisine shaped by French technique, African ingredients and methods, Spanish seasoning traditions, indigenous knowledge of local plants and shellfish, and the Caribbean influences flooding in with every wave of refugees, continued to evolve into something that had no real parallel anywhere else in America. Gumbo, which takes its very name from the Bantu word for okra, combined a French roux with African vegetables, indigenous file powder made from sassafras leaves, and whatever the cook had at hand: shrimp, crab, oysters, chicken, and andouille sausage. Jambalaya bore the unmistakable influence of Spanish paella and West African rice cooking traditions. The beignet came from French pastry making. Red beans and rice was a Monday tradition born from the practicality of leaving beans to simmer slowly while the week's laundry was done. Every dish in the New Orleans canon is a condensed history of the city itself, a record of every culture that contributed to its making. The music was developing in parallel. Congo Square, a large open space at the edge of the French Quarter, was the one place in the entire American South where enslaved people were permitted to gather on Sundays to sing, drum, and dance in the traditions of their African homelands. This was unusual enough to attract curious white observers, who wrote about it with a mixture of fascination and unease. What they were witnessing, without fully understanding it, was the preservation of African musical traditions that would eventually, over the course of the following century, combine with European harmonic structures, the blues of the Deep South, the syncopated rhythms of ragtime, and the improvisational spirit of people who had learned to find freedom within constraint to produce jazz, perhaps the most significant American art form ever created, and one that was born specifically in New Orleans, in the neighborhoods shaped by the gens de couleur libres and the convergence of every culture the city contained. In San Antonio, the political earthquakes of this period arrived from a different direction, but they were no less transformative. While New Orleans was being transferred from Spain to France to the United States in the space of 3 years, San Antonio was being swept up in the enormous upheaval of Mexican independence. New Spain, the vast colonial territory that Spain had governed for 3 centuries, had been growing restless for decades by the early 19th century. The ideas of the Enlightenment, the example of the American and French revolutions, and the deep resentments accumulated by criollos, mestizos, and indigenous peoples under colonial rule all combined into a revolutionary pressure that finally exploded in 1810 when the priest Miguel Hidalgo rang his church bell in the town of Dolores and issued his famous Grito de Dolores, the Cry of Dolores, calling the people to revolt against Spanish rule. San Antonio, as one of the most important settlements in the northern reaches of New Spain, was drawn immediately into the conflict. The city changed hands multiple times during the decade-long Mexican War of Independence, which finally concluded in 1821 with Mexico achieving independence from Spain. San Antonio became part of the new Mexican nation, administered under the state of Coahuila y Texas, a combined state that yoked Texas to a far larger territory to the south, a political arrangement that Tejano, as the Mexican Texans called themselves, would find increasingly frustrating as the years passed. The period between Mexican independence in 1821 and the Texas Revolution of 1836 is one of the most complicated in San Antonio's history, because it involves the collision of at least three distinct groups with very different visions for what Texas should be. The Tejano population, people like the Navarro and Seguin families, whose roots in San Antonio went back generations, were Mexican citizens who were deeply attached to their land, their Catholic faith, and their own political traditions. The Anglo-American settlers who began pouring into Texas after Mexico opened the territory to colonization in the early 1820s brought a different set of assumptions about land, race, governance, and the institution of slavery, which Mexico had abolished. And the Mexican federal government, alternately liberal and conservative, depending on who held power in Mexico City, struggled to maintain coherent authority over a territory so distant from the capital. The result was a collision that the historical memory of Texas has simplified almost beyond recognition. The Texas Revolution of 1835 and 1836 was not simply a story of heroic Anglo settlers throwing off the tyranny of a Mexican dictator, though that is how it was told for generations. It was a far messier conflict in which Tejano fought on both sides, in which Anglo settlers' desire to preserve slavery played a significant role in their resistance to Mexican authority, and in which the city of San Antonio served as the primary stage for the most dramatic events of the war. The Siege of the Alamo, which took place in February and March of 1836, has become one of the most mythologized episodes in American history. A relatively small force of Texian defenders, fewer than 200 people, including a number of Tejano among them, barricaded themselves inside the former mission San Antonio de Valero against a Mexican army under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna that vastly outnumbered them. After a siege of 13 days, the Mexican army overwhelmed the defenders and killed virtually all of them. Among the dead were figures who had already become legendary in American frontier mythology: Jim Bowie, William Barrett Travis, Davy Crockett. What the myth has always elided is the presence of the Tejano defenders inside the Alamo. Men like Juan Seguin, who fought alongside the Anglo-Texians and whose family had deep roots in San Antonio, and who would find, after the Texas Revolution succeeded, that Anglo-American political power in the new Republic of Texas had very little room for Mexican Texans, regardless of which side they had fought on. The Alamo became a symbol of Texas independence, a sacred site of Anglo-American sacrifice, and in that process of mythologization, the Tejano presence within it was quietly erased from the popular narrative, a historical injustice that scholars and descendants have been working to correct ever since. The Texas Republic existed from 1836 until 1845, when Texas was annexed by the United States, an event that almost immediately triggered the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. That war ended with Mexico ceding an enormous swath of its northern territory to the United States. The present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming, in addition to confirming the Rio Grande as the border of Texas. San Antonio, which had been a Mexican city, became an American one, though it remained, in its culture, its language, its food, its faith, and its memory, deeply and irreducibly Mexican. The parallels to New Orleans are striking and worth dwelling on. Both cities were absorbed into the United States not through gradual settlement, but through sudden, dramatic political transfers. New Orleans by purchase, San Antonio by conquest. Both cities had populations who had not chosen to become American and who brought with them entire civilizations of language, religion, cuisine, and cultural practice that did not fit neatly into the Anglo-Protestant American mainstream. Both cities responded to American annexation by doing something quietly extraordinary. They preserved themselves. They bent when they had to. They accommodated when they must. But underneath the American overlay, the older cultures persisted, transformed slightly by the encounter, but never dissolved by it. In New Orleans, French remained the dominant spoken language for decades after the Louisiana Purchase. Spanish legal traditions were codified into Louisiana's unique civil law system. The Catholic Church maintained its central role in the city's social life. And the music, the food, the carnival traditions, the complicated racial geography, all of it continued to develop according to its own internal logic, answering to its own history far more than to any directive from Washington. In San Antonio, Spanish remained the dominant language of the majority of the population for much of the 19th century. The Catholic missions, some crumbling but still spiritually alive, continue to serve as centers of community faith. The feast days, the religious processions, the tamales at Christmas, and the pan dulce at breakfast, and the curandera in the neighborhood who knew the old remedies. All of this persisted beneath and alongside the Anglo-American institutions that were being built over it. This city was officially American, but it was culturally, in its bones, something older and more complex than that. And this is perhaps the deepest truth about both of these cities, the thing that makes them endlessly fascinating and endlessly worthy of study. They're cities that have been conquered more than once. They're cities that have been told, repeatedly, by successive powers, that their old ways must give way to new ones. And they have responded, each time, with a kind of cultural stubbornness that looks on the surface like accommodation, but is actually something closer to survival. The survival not just of people, but of entire ways of being in the world. The French did not erase the indigenous world they built upon in Louisiana. The Spanish did not erase the French character of New Orleans. The Americans did not erase the Spanish and French and African character of the city they inherited. And in San Antonio, the Anglo-American settlers who flooded into Texas after independence did not erase the Tejano, Mexican, Spanish, and indigenous world that had been there for centuries before them. The cities absorbed their conquerors as much as they were shaped by them. They took what was given and they turned it into something of their own. That capacity, that stubborn, joyful, sometimes painful creative resilience, is what we will continue to follow as both cities move into the turbulent middle of the 19th century, toward the defining American catastrophe of the Civil War, and toward the extraordinary cultural flowering that would emerge from its aftermath. By the middle of the 19th century, both New Orleans and San Antonio had survived political upheaval, cultural collision, and the slow, grinding work of becoming something new while holding on to something old. They were cities in motion, cities still in the process of defining themselves. And then the Civil War arrived, and everything, for both cities, for the entire South and Southwest, for the nation itself, was torn apart and remade again. The Civil War is often taught as a conflict between the North and the South, a clean geographical divide between two opposing visions of America. But the reality, as both New Orleans and San Antonio make vividly clear, was far messier, far more morally complicated, and far more geographically nuanced than that simple map suggests. Both cities entered the war carrying the weight of their particular histories, their mixed populations, their colonial inheritances, their complicated racial geographies, and both emerged from it permanently changed, though in ways that differed significantly from each other. New Orleans in 1860 was the wealthiest city in the American South and the fourth largest city in the entire United States, with a population of roughly 168,000 people. Its port handled more agricultural exports than any other port in the country. The cotton and sugar that flowed through it represented some of the most concentrated wealth in the hemisphere, and virtually all of that wealth rested on the foundation of enslaved black labor. The New Orleans slave market was the largest in North America, a place where human beings were bought and sold with a commercial efficiency that the city's beautiful architecture and sophisticated cultural life could not disguise or excuse. The enslaved population of Louisiana was not passive in the face of this brutality. The German Coast Uprising of 1811, which took place about 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, was the largest slave revolt in American history, involving somewhere between 200 and 500 enslaved people who marched toward New Orleans under a territorial militia flag before being violently suppressed. Its leader, Charles Dessalines, who was likely of Haitian origin, understood that freedom had to be seized, not waited for. The revolt was crushed, its leaders executed in the most gruesome public manner imaginable as a warning to others. But the memory of resistance persisted, passed quietly through generations, and the desire for freedom never died. Louisiana seceded from the Union in January of 1861, and New Orleans found itself almost immediately at the center of the war's strategic calculations. The Union command understood what the Confederacy also understood, that New Orleans was the key to the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River was the key to the continent. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled the economic lifeline of the entire Confederate interior. And so, in April of 1862, Union Admiral David Farragut led a fleet of warships past the Confederate forts guarding the river's mouth in one of the most daring naval operations of the war, and seized New Orleans, barely a year into the conflict, making it the first major Confederate city to fall to Union forces. The occupation of New Orleans by Union General Benjamin Butler, who arrived in May of 1862, was one of the most contentious episodes of the entire war. Butler was heavy-handed, imperious, and genuinely despised by the white Creole population of the city, who called him Beast Butler, and worse. He imposed martial law, executed a man who tore down a Union flag, and issued his infamous General Order No. 28, which declared that any woman of New Orleans who insulted a Union soldier would be treated as a woman of the streets plying her trade, a deliberately provocative order that scandalized the Confederacy and made Butler famous throughout the South as a symbol of Yankee brutality. But Butler's occupation also had dimensions that the white Creole narrative has always been reluctant to acknowledge. He organized the first Black Union Army regiment in American history, the 1st Louisiana Native Guards, drawing on the city's large and well-organized community of free men of color, many of whom had initially been pressed into Confederate service, but who had no investment in a Confederate victory and every reason to hope for Union success. These men, some of them educated, some of them wealthy by the standards of the time, became part of a broader story of Black military service that would reshape the politics of Reconstruction. For the enslaved population of New Orleans and the surrounding plantations, the Union occupation meant something profound and immediate: the possibility of freedom. Enslaved people fled to Union lines in enormous numbers, and the city's Black population, both free and newly freed, began to build new institutions, new churches, new schools, and new political organizations with a speed and energy that astonished outside observers. The desire for education in particular was fierce and nearly universal. Adults and children crowded into whatever spaces could be converted to classrooms. Literacy, which had been illegal for enslaved people under Louisiana law, became a form of liberation in the most literal sense. San Antonio's experience of the Civil War was different in almost every dimension, beginning with the fact that Texas itself was deeply divided over secession in ways that the Confederate mythology has long obscured. The governor of Texas at the time of secession, Sam Houston, the hero of San Jacinto, the father of the Texas Republic, one of the most legendary figures in Texas history, opposed secession vehemently and was removed from office rather than swear an oath of loyalty to the Confederacy. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent his life studying the nature of power, that Texas was making a catastrophic mistake. San Antonio, with its large German immigrant population and its deep Mexican-American majority, was one of the least enthusiastic Confederate cities in the state. German settlers who had arrived in the Texas Hill Country in the 1840s and settled in communities around San Antonio were, as a group, opposed to slavery on both moral and economic grounds. They were small farmers and craftsmen who had no use for the plantation system and who had carried their European liberal political traditions with them across the Atlantic. Many of them refused Confederate service outright. In August of 1862, a group of German Unionists attempting to flee to Mexico and join the Union Army was ambushed by Confederate forces at the Nueces River in what became known as the Nueces Massacre, a dark episode in Texas history that is rarely taught, but that speaks volumes about the coercive reality of Confederate loyalty. The Tejano population of San Antonio was similarly ambivalent, at best, about the Confederate cause. Some wealthy Tejano landowners with economic ties to the plantation system supported the Confederacy. But the majority of San Antonio's Mexican-American population had little reason to fight for a government that had been systematically dispossessing them of their land since Texas independence, and many found ways to avoid Confederate service entirely. The borderlands around San Antonio during the Civil War were a landscape of guerrilla activity, draft evasion, refugee movement, and the complex loyalties of people for whom neither the Union nor the Confederacy represented genuine liberation. What the Civil War did to San Antonio, most concretely, was to militarize it. The city had always had a military dimension, the Presidio at its founding, the various armies that had contested it during the Texas Revolution and the Mexican-American War, but the Civil War and its aftermath cemented San Antonio's identity as a military town in ways that would shape its economy and culture for the next century and a half. Fort Sam Houston, which would become one of the most important military installations in the United States, had its origins in this period, and the relationship between San Antonio and the American military would grow deeper with every subsequent decade, right through both world wars and beyond. When the Civil War ended in 1865, both cities entered the period known as Reconstruction. The attempt, however incomplete and ultimately failed, to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into American civic life as genuine citizens. Reconstruction was, in the words of the historian Eric Foner, America's unfinished revolution, and nowhere was that incompleteness more consequential than in New Orleans. New Orleans during Reconstruction was the site of some of the most extraordinary and some of the most horrifying events of the entire era. On the extraordinary side, Louisiana's Reconstruction government was the most racially integrated state government in American history up to that point. Black men voted, held office, served in the legislature, and occupied positions of genuine political power. PBS Pinchback, who was of mixed racial heritage, served briefly as governor of Louisiana in 1872 and 1873, making him the first black governor in American history, a fact that would not be repeated for over a century. The integrated public schools of Reconstruction-era New Orleans were, for a brief and shining moment, a genuine experiment in multiracial democracy. On the horrifying side, the white supremacist backlash against black political power was savage and sustained. The Mechanics' Institute massacre of 1866, in which a white mob attacked a Republican convention that included black delegates, killed dozens of people and was carried out in broad daylight with the participation of the New Orleans police. The Battle of Liberty Place in 1874 involved a paramilitary organization called the White League, which was essentially an organized campaign of racial terrorism, staging an armed insurrection against the Reconstruction state government. They succeeded for several days before federal troops restored order, and the monument subsequently erected to commemorate their action stood in a prominent New Orleans intersection until 2017, when the city finally removed it, a reminder of how long the Civil War's contested meanings remained embedded in the city's physical landscape. Reconstruction formally ended in Louisiana in 1877, when the federal government withdrew its troops as part of the political compromise that settled the disputed presidential election of 1876. The integrated schools were resegregated. Black voters were systematically disenfranchised through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright violence. The brief experiment in multiracial democracy was dismantled, replaced by the system of racial apartheid that would come to be called Jim Crow. In New Orleans, the city of such extraordinary racial complexity, was squeezed into the crude binary of American racial segregation with a violence that permanently damaged its social fabric. The legal culmination of this process arrived in 1892 in the form of a carefully orchestrated legal challenge that originated in New Orleans. Homer Plessy, a man who was 7/8 white by the racial classifications of the time, but legally black under Louisiana's one-drop rule, deliberately sat in a whites-only railroad car as part of a planned test case organized by the Comite de Citoyens, a committee of New Orleans Creoles of color who hoped to challenge Louisiana's Separate Car Act in the courts. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which in 1896 issued its infamous ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, establishing the doctrine of separate but equal that would provide the legal justification for segregation across the entire United States for the next 60 years. It is one of the great bitter ironies of American history that the legal precedent for segregation was established in New Orleans, the most racially complex city in America, the city where the very categories of separate and equal had always been most visibly inadequate to describe the reality of how people actually lived. In San Antonio, the post-Civil War decades brought their own forms of dispossession and resilience. The Reconstruction period in Texas was shorter and less dramatic than in Louisiana. Texas was readmitted to the Union in 1870, but the systematic stripping of land from Tejano families that had been underway since the 1830s accelerated after the war. Anglo-American lawyers, land speculators, and political operators used a combination of legal manipulation, debt, taxation, intimidation, and outright fraud to transfer land that had belonged to Mexican-American families for generations into Anglo hands. The process was not random or incidental. It was the application of racial and economic power to the task of dispossession, and it reshaped the landscape of South Texas permanently. What the Tejano community built in response to this dispossession was a parallel civic world, a network of mutual aid societies called mutualistas, which provided their members with insurance, legal assistance, social support, and a framework for collective action. They built their own newspapers, their own theaters, their own political organizations. The Spanish-language press in San Antonio was vibrant and politically engaged, publishing journalism that documented injustice and argued for the rights of Mexican-American citizens with a sophistication and passion that the Anglo press largely ignored. The Catholic Church remained the central institution of San Antonio's Mexican-American community, and the feast days and religious celebrations that structured the community's year became, in the context of dispossession and discrimination, something more than mere religious observance. They were acts of cultural affirmation. They were declarations that this community existed, that it had a history, that it had a right to its own traditions and its own ways of marking time. The elaborate celebration of Días de los Muertos, the processions of Semana Santa, the Christmas posadas, all of these continue to be observed with an intensity that reflected not just faith, but identity. And it was in this period, in the late 19th century, that San Antonio's fiesta celebrations began to take the organized civic form that we recognize today. What had been informal religious and community celebrations were gradually institutionalized into a formal civic festival, initially organized by the Anglo elite of San Antonio as a celebration of Texas history, specifically as a commemoration of the Battle of San Jacinto, the decisive battle of the Texas Revolution. The Battle of Flowers Parade, which remains a centerpiece of fiesta to this day, was first organized in 1891 by a group of women who wanted to honor the heroes of the Alamo and San Jacinto with a parade of flower-decorated carriages. That it was organized by women, and that it remains to this day one of the only parades in the United States commanded by women, is a fact worth pausing on, a small subversive thread woven into the fabric of an otherwise very conventional civic pageant. Over time, what had begun as a commemoration of Anglo-Texan military victory expanded to incorporate the full cultural diversity of San Antonio. The Tejano traditions, the German heritage, the African-American community celebrations, and eventually the enormous contemporary Mexican-American cultural presence that makes fiesta today one of the most genuinely multicultural urban festivals in the United States. And so, by the close of the 19th century, both cities had been through the fire, literally and figuratively, and had come through it scarred, changed, diminished in some ways, and deepened in others. New Orleans had been occupied, liberated, reconstructed, and then subjected to the slow violence of Jim Crow. San Antonio had been absorbed, militarized, and watched its Tejano majority gradually dispossessed. Both cities had seen their most vulnerable populations stripped of political rights, economic opportunity, and physical safety. And in both cities, those populations had responded with a creativity, a stubbornness, and a cultural vitality that would, in the century to come, produce some of the most important art, music, food, and civic culture in American history. The 20th century was waiting, with its Great Migration, its world wars, its civil rights movements, its urban upheavals, and its extraordinary musical and cultural explosions. New Orleans was about to give the world jazz in its fully realized form. San Antonio was about to give the world conjunto music and the beginnings of what would become the Tejano sound. Both cities were about to step from the regional margins towards something approaching the center of American cultural life. But that is the story of the next hour. For now, sit with the weight of what these cities had already survived. Sit with the knowledge that the beauty you encounter when you walk their streets, the music floating from a doorway, the smell of food that carries 100 years of history in every bite, the architecture that contains the memory of every empire that ever claimed it, all of that beauty was made by people who were given very little and who turned what they had into something extraordinary. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. There is a moment in the life of every great city when the accumulated pressure of everything it has been, every culture it has absorbed, every grief it has survived, every joy it has managed to manufacture out of impossible circumstances, finally finds a form, a shape, a sound. For New Orleans, that moment arrived at the turn of the 20th century, in the neighborhoods along the lower edge of the French Quarter and in the Treme, the oldest African-American neighborhood in the United States, where the musical traditions of a dozen different worlds have been slowly, quietly, irresistibly converging for 100 years. For San Antonio, that moment came a little later, in the dance halls and cantinas of the West Side, where the accordion and the bajo sexto guitar found each other and produced a sound so particular, so rooted in the specific experience of the Texas-Mexican borderlands, that it could not have been born anywhere else on Earth. The 20th century was, for both cities, a century of extraordinary cultural creation set against a backdrop of racial violence, economic inequality, and the slow, uneven, still incomplete work of justice. To tell it honestly is to hold both of those truths at the same time, the beauty and the brutality, the music and the silence that the music was always trying to fill. Jazz did not spring fully formed from any single moment or any single person. It grew, the way all great art forms grow, from a long accumulation of influences, experiments, and encounters that only became visible as a coherent thing in retrospect. But if you had to point to a place and a time, you would point to New Orleans in the years between roughly 1895 and 1920, and you would point specifically to the world of Storyville. Storyville was the legally sanctioned red light district of New Orleans, established by city ordinance in 1897 and operating until the federal government forced its closure in 1917 on the grounds that it was a threat to the morality of military personnel stationed nearby. For those 20 years, it was a place where the social rules that governed the rest of New Orleans, the strict racial hierarchies, the careful separations of class and color, were somewhat suspended in the pursuit of commerce and pleasure. Musicians of different backgrounds played together. Audiences of different races mingled in ways that would have been unacceptable elsewhere. And the music that emerged from those encounters, the music of Buddy Bolden, who is widely credited as the first jazz band leader, of Jelly Roll Morton, who was a Creole of color from the 7th Ward, and who later claimed somewhat extravagantly, but not entirely falsely, to have invented jazz, of King Oliver and Louis Armstrong and Sidney Bechet, was something genuinely new under the sun. Louis Armstrong deserves particular attention, not just because he became perhaps the most famous musician New Orleans ever produced, but because his life story is a condensed version of the city's own story. He was born in 1901 in a neighborhood so poor and so rough that it was known as the Battlefield, in the back of town near the Treme. He grew up in poverty, was sent to the colored waifs' home for boys after firing a pistol into the air on New Year's Eve, and it was there, in that institution, that he first received formal musical instruction. He went on to transform American music, and through American music, world music, with a trumpet tone and an improvisational genius that came directly from the specific world New Orleans had made him. His warmth, his humor, his accessibility, and his extraordinary technical virtuosity were all of a piece with the city that formed him. A city that had learned to find joy in the most unlikely places because the alternative was despair. Jazz moved out of New Orleans partly through the closure of Storyville, which scattered its musicians across the country, and partly through the Great Migration, the massive movement of Black Americans from the rural and urban South to the industrial cities of the North that accelerated after World War I. Chicago and New York became the next great centers of jazz development, and the music transformed as it moved, absorbing new influences and evolving in new directions. but it always knew where it came from. The New Orleans funeral tradition, the solemn, slow march to the cemetery followed by the joyful, dancing second line back, remained embedded in jazz's DNA, a reminder that the music had been born from a community that understood grief and celebration not as opposites, but as two faces of the same profound human experience. The years between World War I and World War II were, for New Orleans, a time of deep contradiction. The city was producing some of the most vital and important music in the world. It was also enforcing some of the most brutal and comprehensive systems of racial apartheid in the American South. The two facts were not separate. They were intimately connected, because the same system that confined Black New Orleanians to poverty, to segregated schools and hospitals and streetcars and neighborhoods, also concentrated them in communities of extraordinary density and cultural richness, where the music and the food and the language and the spiritual life reinforced each other constantly. The Treme, in particular, was a neighborhood of remarkable cultural intensity. It was home to the social aid and pleasure clubs, organizations that had evolved from the mutual aid societies of the 19th century into something that combined practical support with elaborate cultural expression. The clubs organized the second-line parades that moved through the neighborhood streets on Sundays, with their brass bands and their dancing crowds. And these parades were not merely entertainment. They were assertions of dignity, declarations of communal existence, rituals of collective joy in a world that denied Black people so much. The second-line tradition is alive in New Orleans today, still organized by the same clubs, still moving through the same neighborhoods, still performing the same function, which is to say, still insisting that these people exist, that they matter, that they know how to live beautifully even when the world around them has never made that easy. Mardi Gras during this period was officially a segregated celebration, which meant in practice that Black New Orleanians created their own Mardi Gras culture alongside and beneath and around the official white crews and their elaborate parades. The most extraordinary expression of this parallel culture was the tradition of the Mardi Gras Indians, Black men and women who spent the entire year hand-sewing astonishing suits of feathers, beads, and rhinestones in the tradition of Native American ceremonial dress, and who appeared on Mardi Gras Day and St. Joseph's Day in these elaborate creations to parade through their own neighborhoods in a celebration that had nothing to do with Canal Street or the Rex Parade or any of the official civic pageantry. The origins of the Mardi Gras Indian tradition are complex and debated, but they speak to something real about the relationship between African American and Indigenous communities in Louisiana, a relationship of solidarity forged in the shared experience of marginalization, of people who had been pushed to the edges of the official world finding each other there and creating something beautiful. The suits that the Indians wear, which can weigh over 100 pounds and can take thousands of hours to create, are among the most extraordinary works of folk art produced anywhere in America. The call and response chants, the elaborate rituals of encounter between different tribes, the hierarchy of positions from the spy boy who scouts ahead to the big chief who leads the procession. All of this constitutes a living cultural tradition of extraordinary depth and beauty, and it is entirely the creation of Black New Orleans. In San Antonio, the early 20th century brought its own extraordinary cultural flowering, shaped by a very different set of circumstances, but rooted in the same fundamental dynamic. A community that had been denied political power and economic opportunity, channeling its energy into cultural creation of the highest order. The Mexican Revolution, which erupted in 1910 and continued in various forms through the 1920s, sent enormous waves of refugees north across the Rio Grande into Texas. And San Antonio, as the largest city near the border, received a huge influx of Mexican immigrants of every class and background: intellectuals, artists, musicians, former revolutionaries, peasants, and professionals who had been displaced by the violence and uncertainty of the conflict. This immigration transformed San Antonio's west side into one of the most vibrant Mexican cultural enclaves in the United States. A neighborhood that had its own theaters showing Mexican films, its own Spanish-language newspapers, its own restaurants, its own musicians, and its own political organizations. The music that was developing in the cantinas and dance halls of San Antonio's west side in the 1920s and 1930s was something genuinely new. The accordion, which had been introduced to the Texas-Mexican borderlands by German and Czech immigrants in the 19th century, had been enthusiastically adopted by Mexican-American musicians who discovered that its sound, loud, reedy, penetrating, was perfectly suited to the dance halls where working-class Tejano gathered on weekends. Paired with the bajo sexto, a 12-string guitar that provided rhythmic and harmonic foundation, the accordion became the voice of a new musical form that would eventually be called conjunto. The man who is most credited with crystallizing conjunto into its definitive form was Narciso Martinez, a farm worker and musician from the Rio Grande Valley who began recording for Bluebird Records in San Antonio in 1936. Martinez, who became known as El Hurricane del Valle, the Hurricane of the Valley, stripped away the left-hand bass lines that had previously been played on the accordion and replaced them entirely with the bajo sexto, creating a lighter, faster, more rhythmically driving sound that was ideally suited for dancing. His recordings sold by the tens of thousands to working-class Mexican-American audiences across Texas and the Southwest, and the template he established became the foundation for everything that followed, for the polkas and redovas and wapangos that filled the dance halls of San Antonio for the next several decades, and eventually for the Tejano music that would produce stars of national and international stature later in the century. What is striking about conjunto, when you listen to it with New Orleans jazz in your ear, is how similar the underlying dynamic is. Both musical forms were created by communities that had been denied access to the official culture of the dominant society. Both drew on multiple musical traditions: European, African, Indigenous, and Caribbean in the case of jazz, Mexican, German, Czech, and Indigenous in the case of conjunto, and synthesized them into something that was entirely their own. Both were initially dismissed or ignored by the mainstream cultural establishment, and then, decades later, recognized as among the most significant American musical forms of the 20th century. And both remained, throughout their development, music of the people, music made for dancing, for communal celebration, for the expression of joy and sorrow and love and longing in language that everyone in the community could understand. The Great Depression hit both cities hard, but it hit their most vulnerable populations hardest. In New Orleans, the already dire economic conditions of the Black community worsened dramatically, and the city's elaborate system of social aid and pleasure clubs, mutual aid societies, and community institutions strained under the pressure. The music scene contracted as venues closed and musicians struggled to find work. Some of the greatest jazz musicians of the era, men who had helped create an entirely new art form, died in poverty and obscurity, their contributions unrecognized by the mainstream culture that was simultaneously consuming and profiting from the music they had made. In San Antonio, the Depression brought something even more brutal: the mass deportation and so-called repatriation of Mexican and Mexican-American residents, including many who were American citizens by birth. Between 1929 and 1936, the federal government and various state and local authorities pressured, coerced, and in many cases forcibly deported somewhere between 400,000 and 2 million people of Mexican origin from the United States, roughly 60% of whom were American citizens. San Antonio's west side lost a significant portion of its population to this campaign, which was driven by a combination of economic anxiety, the desire to reduce competition for jobs and relief resources, and racial hostility. Families were separated. Citizens were expelled from their own country. Communities that had existed for generations were scattered. It was one of the largest forced migrations in American history, and it left wounds in San Antonio's Mexican-American community that took generations to begin to heal. The New Deal brought some relief to both cities, and in ways that went beyond the purely economic. The Federal Writers Project, part of the Works Progress Administration, employed writers across the country to document local history, folklore, and cultural life. And in New Orleans, this meant a collection of oral histories from elderly residents who had been born into slavery. Testimonies of breathtaking historical importance that preserved voices that would otherwise have been lost entirely. The Federal Music Project provided employment to musicians and supported the documentation of folk music traditions. The Federal Art Project commissioned murals and public artworks that brought the history and culture of these cities to wider audiences. The New Deal, for all its racial compromises and limitations, invested in the cultural life of both cities in ways that left lasting traces. And then World War II arrived, and everything changed again. For both cities, the war brought an enormous influx of military personnel, defense industry workers, and economic activity that pulled them out of the Depression's depths. For both cities, it also created the conditions for the next great confrontation with the racial order that had constrained their most vulnerable populations since Reconstruction. Black servicemen from New Orleans who fought for their country in segregated units against fascism abroad and returned home to face segregation and racial terrorism at home were not willing to simply accept the old arrangements any longer. Mexican-American veterans from San Antonio who had served with distinction, and the 36th Infantry Division, which drew heavily from Texas, had one of the most distinguished combat records of the war, came home to find that their service had not purchased them equality, that they still could not eat in certain restaurants or swim in certain pools or expect equal treatment from the institutions their tax dollars supported. The war had changed something fundamental in the psychological landscape of both communities. It had demonstrated, at enormous cost, that the promise of American democracy was real enough to die for, and it had made the gap between that promise and the lived reality of life in New Orleans and San Antonio impossible to continue accepting. The civil rights movements that would transform both cities in the decades to come were already forming in the minds and hearts of people who had been to war and come back unwilling to be less than what they had proven themselves to be. The stage was being set for the most consequential social transformation these cities had seen since Reconstruction. The music was about to change again. The streets were about to fill with a different kind of procession, and the long, painful, still unfinished work of making the promise of these cities real for all of their people was about to enter its most dramatic chapter. But before we follow these cities into the upheaval of the civil rights era, sit for a moment with the music. Put on Louis Armstrong playing West End blues, recorded in Chicago in 1928, but born entirely from the world New Orleans made him. Put on Narciso Martinez playing La Chacarera, recorded in San Antonio in 1936, the accordion dancing over the bajo sexto like something that has always existed and always will. Listen to what those sounds contain, the grief and the joy, the memory of every generation that came before, the stubbornness of people who refused to stop making beauty in a world that kept trying to take everything from them. That is the sound of these cities at their deepest. That is the sound of everything this story has been building toward, and everything it still is left to say. There is a particular quality to the light in New Orleans in the early morning, before the heat has fully committed to the day, when the streets are still damp from the night before, and the jasmine is doing its work in the air, and the city feels, briefly, like it belongs entirely to itself. There is a similar quality to the light in San Antonio at dusk, when the limestone buildings catch the last of the afternoon sun and turn a warm gold, and the sound of the river moving through the city center carries just enough of a breeze to make the heat bearable. These are cities that reward stillness and attention. They're cities that have stories written into every surface, if you know how to read them. The stories that were written into those surfaces in the 1950s and 1960s were among the most urgent and the most painful in either city's history. The civil rights era arrived in New Orleans and San Antonio not as an abstraction, not as something happening elsewhere, in Birmingham or Selma or Washington, but as an immediate, local, daily struggle fought by ordinary people in ordinary places, at lunch counters and school board meetings and polling stations and church halls, by people who had been waiting their entire lives for the promise of these cities to be extended to them fully and without condition. In New Orleans, the civil rights movement unfolded against the backdrop of one of the most entrenched and elaborate systems of racial segregation in the American South. The city's segregation was not simply a matter of law. It was a matter of architecture, of geography, of custom, of the 1,000 daily rituals of humiliation that enforced the racial order in ways that no single statute could fully capture. Black New Orleanians rode in the back of streetcars, drank from separate fountains, attended separate schools that received a fraction of the funding of white schools, were excluded from the city's finest restaurants and hotels and theaters, and were confined to neighborhoods that the city systematically underinvested in while extracting their labor and their taxes. The resistance to this system was organized, persistent, and deeply rooted in the institutional life of Black New Orleans. The NAACP had been active in the city since the 1910s. The Urban League worked on economic issues. Black churches, which were the organizational backbone of civil rights activity everywhere in the South, were particularly powerful in New Orleans, where the Catholic tradition had produced a network of Black Catholic parishes and schools. Institutions like Xavier University, founded in 1925 by St. Catherine Drexel, which became the only historically Black Catholic university in the United States, and which trained generations of Black professionals, teachers, and activists who carried the movement forward. The desegregation of New Orleans public schools in 1960 was one of the most dramatic and widely publicized episodes of the entire civil rights era, when a federal court ordered the Orleans Parish School Board to begin integrating its schools. The board complied with absolute minimum compliance, admitting 4 6-year-old Black girls to 2 previously all-white elementary schools. The girls' names were Ruby Bridges, Tessie Prevost, Gail Etienne, and Leona Tate. Ruby Bridges, who was assigned to William Frantz Elementary School, became the most famous of the 4, partly because the painter Norman Rockwell depicted her in a painting that became one of the iconic images of the civil rights era. A small girl in a white dress and white hair ribbons, escorted by federal marshals through a mob of screaming white adults, walking with a dignity that shamed everyone around her. What the famous painting captures is only a fraction of what those children and their families endured. White parents pulled their children from both schools in protest. The white teachers at William Frantz refused to teach Ruby Bridges. Only one teacher, a woman from Boston named Barbara Henry, was willing to have her in class, and she taught Ruby alone for most of the year in an otherwise empty classroom. The family of Ruby Bridges faced economic retaliation. Her father lost his job, The grocery store where a family shopped refused to serve them. The courage required to place a child in that situation, and the courage required of that child to walk through that door every single day, is almost impossible to fully comprehend. The desegregation crisis revealed something important about New Orleans that had always been true, but that the myth of the city's cosmopolitanism had sometimes obscured: that the racial violence and racial terror that characterized the broader South was present in New Orleans too, dressed in different clothes perhaps, inflected by the city's particular history, but no less real and no less destructive for that. The city that had once had the most sophisticated free black community in North America, the city of Creole culture and Congo Square and the Mardi Gras Indians, was also a city where a 6-year-old girl needed federal marshals to go to school. The civil rights struggle in San Antonio had its own distinctive character, shaped by the fact that the primary community seeking equal rights was Mexican American rather than African American, and that the legal and political frameworks for addressing the discrimination were, in important ways, different and more complicated. Mexican Americans occupied an ambiguous position in the American racial system. They were legally classified as white in many contexts, which meant that the explicit racial segregation laws that apply to Black Americans did not always technically apply to them, but they faced discrimination that was pervasive, systematic, and often equally brutal in practice. The American GI Forum, one of the most important Mexican-American civil rights organizations in the country, was founded in Corpus Christi, Texas in 1948 by Dr. Hector P. Garcia, a physician and World War II veteran who was galvanized into action by the case of Felix Longoria, a Mexican-American soldier killed in the Philippines who was denied burial services at the only funeral home in his hometown of Three Rivers, Texas, because of his ethnicity. The GI Forum became a powerful advocate for Mexican-American veterans and their families, and San Antonio, with its enormous Mexican-American population and its deep military connections, became one of its most important centers of activity. The political organizing that was happening in San Antonio's Mexican-American community during the 1950s and 1960s was building towards something that would fundamentally transform the city's governance. The west side of San Antonio, the predominantly Mexican-American neighborhoods that had been systematically underserved by the city government for generations, had no paved streets in many areas, no adequate drainage, substandard housing, underfunded schools, and no meaningful political representation on the city council. The people who lived there paid taxes, served in the military, worked in the city's homes and restaurants and factories, and received almost nothing in return from the government that was supposed to represent them. The organization that would finally begin to change this was Communities Organized for Public Service, known as COPS, founded in 1974 by a group of Catholic parishes on San Antonio's west and south sides, with the organizing assistance of the Industrial Areas Foundation, which had been founded by the legendary community organizer Saul Alinsky. COPS became one of the most effective community organizing efforts in American history, marshaling the institutional resources of the Catholic Church, its parish networks, its existing community trust, its meeting spaces, in the service of concrete political demands for infrastructure investment, better schools, job training, and fair representation. The women of COPS, in particular, Beatriz Gallego, Ernie Cortez, and dozens of others who organized at the parish level, demonstrated a model of faith-based community organizing that became a national template, studied and replicated in cities across the country. What COPS achieved in San Antonio over the following decades was nothing less than a redistribution of political power. By organizing thousands of voters, turning out enormous crowds at city council meetings, and holding elected officials publicly accountable for their commitments, COPS extracted hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure investment for previously neglected neighborhoods. Streets were paved, drainage systems were built, schools were improved, and the political culture of San Antonio was permanently altered. The Mexican-American majority that had been politically invisible for over a century became the dominant force in the city's civic life. A transformation that culminated in the election of Henry Cisneros as mayor in 1981. Henry Cisneros was the first Mexican-American mayor of a major American city since the 19th century. His election was the product of decades of organizing, of community building, of the slow accumulation of political power by a community that had been told in 1,000 ways that this city did not fully belong to them. Cisneros was young, charismatic, Harvard-educated, and deeply rooted in the San Antonio community, and his mayoralty transformed not just the politics of the city, but its self-image, its sense of what it was and what it could become. He went on to serve as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Clinton, but his legacy in San Antonio is the more enduring one. The proof that a city can change its fundamental relationship with its own people if those people organize and demand it. Back in New Orleans, the civil rights era was producing its own political transformations, though the path was different and in some ways more tortured. The entrenched white political establishment of New Orleans proved extraordinarily resistant to sharing power, and the violence and intimidation used against black political organizing in Louisiana was some of the most brutal in the South. The Deacons for Defense and Justice, a black armed self-defense organization that formed in Louisiana in 1964, was a direct response to the inadequacy of nonviolent protest in the face of Klan terrorism. A reminder that the civil rights movement in Louisiana, as elsewhere, encompassed a much wider range of tactics and philosophies than the sanitized mainstream narrative has always acknowledged. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 transformed the political landscape of New Orleans more than almost any other single piece of legislation. Black voters, finally protected from the systematic disenfranchisement that had excluded them for nearly a century, registered in enormous numbers and began to reshape the city's political life. Dutch Morial, who became the first black mayor of New Orleans in 1978, was the product of this transformation, a man whose entire career had been defined by breaking racial barriers, who had been the first black graduate of Louisiana State University Law School, the first black assistant United States attorney in Louisiana, the first black elected to the Louisiana legislature since Reconstruction. His election as mayor was the culmination of a century of struggle and the beginning of a new chapter in the city's governance. The New Orleans that Dutch Morial inherited was a city in genuine crisis. The oil boom that had temporarily inflated Louisiana's economy in the 1970s was ending. The port, which had been the economic engine of the city for 2 centuries, was being transformed by containerization in ways that eliminated thousands of longshoremen jobs. White flight to the suburbs was hollowing out the city's tax base. The public schools were severely underfunded. Crime was rising, and the infrastructure of a city built on unstable ground was aging and deteriorating in ways that would have catastrophic consequences decades later. These were not problems that any single mayor or administration could solve. They were the accumulated consequences of a century of racial inequality, of deliberate disinvestment in the city's black majority, of an economy that had always been extractive rather than developmental, taking the labor and the resources of the region without reinvesting adequately in the people and communities that produce the wealth. New Orleans in the 1970s and 1980s was a city experiencing the painful gap between its cultural richness and its economic and political dysfunction. A gap that had always been there, but that was now impossible to ignore. And yet the culture continued. The music continued. The food continued. The second lines continued to roll through the streets of the Treme and Central City and the 7th Ward on Sunday afternoons. Mardi Gras continued to arrive every February with its elaborate pageantry and its democratic explosion of joy. The Jazz and Heritage Festival, which was founded in 1970 with a lineup that included Mahalia Jackson, Duke Ellington, Fats Domino, and the Meters, grew from a small event attended by a few thousand people into one of the great music festivals of the world, a celebration of the full breadth of New Orleans musical culture: jazz, blues, gospel, rhythm and blues, Cajun, Zydeco brass band, that drew hundreds of thousands of visitors every year and reminded anyone who needed reminding that this city was, whatever its problems, irreplaceable. The brass band revival of the 1980s deserves special attention because it represented something important about how New Orleans culture regenerates itself. The traditional brass band music that had been the soundtrack of funerals and second lines since the late 19th century had declined significantly by the 1970s, as the musicians who carried the tradition aged and died without obvious successors. The revival was sparked in part by the Dirty Dozen Brass Band, formed in 1977, which took the traditional instrumentation and the traditional repertoire and injected it with the energy of funk, rhythm and blues, and bebop jazz, creating a sound that was simultaneously deeply traditional and startlingly contemporary. They were followed by the Rebirth Brass Band, the Hot 8 Brass Band, and dozens of other groups that transformed the brass band tradition into something that spoke directly to younger generations of New Orleanians while maintaining its deep roots in the community life of the city's black neighborhoods. In San Antonio, the cultural parallel was the flowering of Tejano music into a full-scale popular music industry. The conjunto tradition that Narciso Martinez had helped establish in the 1930s had evolved through the following decades, absorbing influences from rhythm and blues, rock and roll, and Mexican popular music, developing new forms. The orquesta tradition, which added horns and strings to the conjunto template in an aspiration toward mainstream respectability, and producing artists of genuine national stature. By the 1980s, San Antonio had become the capital of Tejano music, home to record labels, radio stations, and a concert circuit that reached Mexican-American communities across the Southwest and beyond. The artist who would finally carry Tejano music to a genuinely mainstream American audience was born in Lake Jackson, Texas in 1971 and grew up performing with her family band. Selena Quintanilla Perez, known simply as Selena, was everything that the Tejano music industry had been building toward without knowing it. She was beautiful and charismatic and genuinely gifted as both a singer and a performer. She sang in Spanish despite having grown up speaking primarily English, learning the language of her cultural heritage in order to connect with an audience that her family and community represented. She won her first Grammy for Best Mexican-American Album in 1994. She was in the process of recording her first English-language crossover album, poised on the edge of mainstream American stardom, when she was murdered in a Corpus Christi hotel room in March of 1995 at the age of 23. The grief that followed Selena's death was enormous and genuine, and said something important about what she had meant. She had been not just a singer, but a symbol, proof that a young woman from a working-class Mexican-American family in South Texas could claim the full inheritance of American popular culture while remaining entirely herself, entirely rooted in her community and her tradition. Her murder felt, to the community that had claimed her, like another in a long series of thefts, another thing taken before its full promise could be realized. The album she was recording at the time of her death, Dreaming of You, was completed posthumously and became one of the fastest-selling albums in American history, debuting at #1 on the Billboard 200, the first Latin artist ever to achieve that distinction. San Antonio named a stretch of highway after her. A life-size bronze statue of her stands on the San Antonio River Walk. And every year at Fiesta, her music fills the air with a persistence that feels less like nostalgia than like refusal. The refusal to let what was taken stay gone. These two cities, moving through the second half of the 20th century, were both grappling with the same fundamental question that American cities everywhere were grappling with: how to hold on to what made them irreplaceable while navigating the forces of economic change, racial reckoning, and political transformation that were remaking American urban life. They were not always successful. They made mistakes, suffered losses, failed people who deserved better. But they also produced, in this period, some of the most extraordinary examples of community resilience, cultural creativity, and democratic organizing in American history. The next chapter, the chapter of Katrina, of the river walk's transformation, of the ongoing negotiation between tourism and authenticity, between gentrification and community survival, between the city as it is marketed to the world and the city as it is actually lived, is the chapter that brings us closest to the present. It is, in some ways, the hardest chapter to tell, because it is still being written and because the forces it describes are still very much at work. But it is also, in its own way, a continuation of everything that came before. These are cities that have survived conquest and fire and flood and plague and injustice and loss, and that have met each of those things with a creativity and a stubbornness and a commitment to communal joy that is, finally, the most important thing about them. There are moments in the life of a city that function like a mirror, moments when everything the city has been, everything it has built and neglected and celebrated and ignored, is suddenly, brutally visible all at once. For New Orleans, that moment came on August 29, 2005, when Hurricane Katrina made landfall on the Louisiana coast, and the federal levee system protecting the city failed in 53 separate places, flooding 80% of New Orleans underwater that in some neighborhoods reached the roof lines of houses. For San Antonio, the mirror arrived more gradually, in the form of a decades-long reckoning with questions of development, displacement, and who the city's growth was actually serving. These were different kinds of crises, one catastrophic and sudden, one slow and structural, but both forced their cities to confront the same essential question that every great city must eventually answer. Who does this place belong to? And what are we willing to do to make sure it belongs to everyone? To understand Katrina fully, you have to understand something that the immediate news coverage largely failed to convey: that the flooding of New Orleans was not a natural disaster in any simple sense. It was a failure of infrastructure, of government, and of the racial and economic priorities that had shaped decisions about that infrastructure for decades. The levee system that was supposed to protect New Orleans had been underfunded, inadequately maintained, and in some places negligently constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers. The communities that flooded most severely and most completely were, with a consistency that was not coincidental, the city's poorest and most heavily black neighborhoods. The lower Ninth Ward, New Orleans East, generally Lakeview in part, communities that have been built on the lowest lying ground precisely because those are the least desirable areas, the areas left to people who had no other options. The images that came out of New Orleans in the days after the levees failed were among the most disturbing in American television history. Tens of thousands of people, overwhelmingly black and poor, stranded on rooftops, in the Superdome, on highway overpasses, without food or water or medical care, waiting for help that did not come for days. The federal government's response, under the Federal Emergency Management Agency Director Michael Brown and the Bush administration, was catastrophically slow and disorganized, a failure so complete and so visible that it shocked even people who had low expectations of government competence. The phrase, "heck of a job, Brownie," spoken by President Bush to his FEMA director in the middle of the crisis, became an instant symbol of governmental indifference to human suffering on a mass scale. Approximately 1,800 people died as a direct result of Katrina and the flooding. The number would have been far higher had not roughly 80% of the city's population evacuated before the storm. But those who could not evacuate, who had no cars, no money for hotels, no family outside the city to flee to, were precisely the people whom the city's economic inequality had left most vulnerable. The storm did not create that inequality. It revealed it with a clarity that was impossible to look away from, at least for a moment. The diaspora that followed the flooding was enormous. An estimated 400,000 people left New Orleans in the immediate aftermath of Katrina, scattered to Houston, Atlanta, Baton Rouge, Dallas, and cities across the country. Many never returned. The city's population, which had been declining slowly for decades due to economic stagnation and suburban flight, dropped from roughly 485,000 before the storm to approximately 230,000 in the months immediately after, a loss of more than half the city's people in a matter of weeks. Entire neighborhoods sat empty for months, and in some cases years. The houses marked with the spray-painted X codes that search and rescue teams had used to record what they found inside. The date of the search, the team that conducted it, the number of survivors, the number of dead. The rebuilding of New Orleans after Katrina was a process of extraordinary complexity, controversy, and, in many cases, injustice. The Road Home program, which was supposed to help homeowners rebuild, was plagued by bureaucratic dysfunction and, documented by researchers at PolicyLink, racial inequity in the way it calculated compensation, a formula that used pre-storm property values, which were systematically lower in black neighborhoods due to decades of discriminatory lending and investment practices, to determine the amount of aid homeowners received. The result was that black homeowners in the flooded neighborhoods received less money to rebuild than white homeowners in comparable situations, even when their actual losses were equivalent. The public housing crisis was equally devastating. Before Katrina, New Orleans had one of the largest concentrations of public housing in the United States. The Lafitte, St. Bernard, C.J. Peet, and B.W. Cooper developments, massive mid-century housing projects that had themselves been the product of racial segregation, built to concentrate poor black residents in specific areas of the city. These developments sustained relatively little flood damage compared to many private homes. They had been built on higher ground, but the city and federal authorities used the opportunity of the storm to demolish all four of them, replacing them with mixed-income developments that housed far fewer low-income residents than the original projects had. Thousands of the city's poorest residents, many of them elderly, were effectively permanently displaced. And yet the city came back. Not entirely, not for everyone, not in ways that were always just or equitable. But it came back with a vitality and a cultural urgency that surprised even people who loved it most. The musicians came back. The chefs came back. The social aid and pleasure clubs reorganized, and the second lines rolled again through neighborhoods that had been underwater. Mardi Gras was held in February of 2006, less than 6 months after the storm, in a city that was still largely in ruins, and it was one of the most emotionally intense Mardi Gras celebrations in the city's history. Not a denial of what had happened, but a direct response to it, an assertion by the people of New Orleans that they were still here, that their culture was still alive, that the city had not been destroyed, even if much of it had been damaged beyond recognition. The Mardi Gras Indians appeared that year in suits of surpassing beauty, sewn in the months of displacement and grief, in hotel rooms in Houston and apartments in Atlanta, because the tradition demanded it, and because the tradition was one of the things worth coming back for. The brass bands played at funerals that had been delayed for months, while families were scattered across the country, finally bringing their dead home to be mourned properly, in the New Orleans way, with music and second lines, and the full communal weight of grief transformed into something that could be survived. The question of what New Orleans would become after Katrina, who would be able to afford to live there, whose culture would be centered, whose needs would be prioritized, became one of the most intensely contested urban questions in America in the years following the storm. The city that emerged from the flooding was in many ways a different city than the one that had existed before, and not always in ways that reflected the values and priorities of the people who had made it what it was. Tourism, which had always been central to New Orleans' economy, became even more dominant in the post-Katrina years. The French Quarter, which had flooded relatively little due to its location on the natural levee of the Mississippi, was quickly restored and reopened for business. Bourbon Street continued to function as the city's most famous and most economically productive address. But the relationship between the tourist economy and the communities that actually sustained the city's culture was, and remains, deeply unequal. The musicians who played in the French Quarter clubs often lived in neighborhoods that were still struggling to recover. The chefs whose restaurants attracted visitors from around the world employed kitchen workers who could barely afford rent in a housing market that had been dramatically transformed by post-storm gentrification. The influx of what locals sometimes called Katrina entrepreneurs, young, mostly white, mostly affluent people who came to New Orleans after the storm drawn by cheap real estate and the opportunity to participate in the city's rebuilding, brought energy and investment, but also displacement. Neighborhoods like the Bywater and the Marigny, which had been working-class Black and Creole neighborhoods for generations, became rapidly gentrifying areas where longtime residents could no longer afford to live. The cultural texture of those neighborhoods, the particular mix of people and music and food and community life that had made them what they were, changed in ways that are still being mourned and contested. This is not a problem unique to New Orleans. It is a problem that virtually every culturally rich American city has faced in the early 21st century, as rising housing costs and the commodification of urban authenticity have created a painful dynamic in which the very qualities that make a neighborhood desirable also make it unaffordable for the people who created those qualities. But in New Orleans, where the cultural stakes are so high and the community that created the culture has already survived so much, the dynamic feels particularly acute and particularly unjust. In San Antonio, the development questions of the late 20th and early 21st century took a different but related form. The city's most famous landmark, the River Walk, the network of pedestrian paths and restaurants and hotels that lines the San Antonio River as it curves through the downtown, is one of the great examples of urban development in American history, and also a complicated one. The River Walk's origins go back to the 1920s, when a local architect named Robert Hugman proposed transforming the frequently flooding river into a landscaped commercial and recreational amenity. The project was eventually funded by the Works Progress Administration during the New Deal and completed in 1941. For decades, it was a modest local amenity, used primarily by residents. Then, in the 1960s, the development of the Hemisphere World's Fair of 1968, which brought enormous investment to the downtown area and required the construction of major hotels connecting to the river, transformed the River Walk into the tourist destination it is today. The River Walk now generates billions of dollars in economic activity annually and is the most visited tourist attraction in Texas. But its development came at a cost that San Antonio's Mexican-American community paid directly. The construction of Hemisphere in 1968 required the demolition of a significant portion of the historic Mexican-American neighborhood that had existed east of downtown. Homes, businesses, and community institutions that had been there for generations were bulldozed to make way for the fairgrounds. The residents who were displaced received inadequate compensation and were scattered to other neighborhoods, disrupting community networks that had provided mutual support and cultural continuity for decades. It was urban renewal in the mode that the writer James Baldwin famously described as Negro removal. The use of development as a mechanism for displacing communities of color from valuable urban land. The expansion of the River Walk in subsequent decades continued to reshape the geography of downtown San Antonio in ways that prioritize tourism and commercial development over the needs of existing communities. The Pearl, a former brewery complex on the northern edge of downtown that was developed into a mixed-use district of restaurants, shops, residences, and a farmer's market in the 2010s, became one of the most celebrated examples of adaptive reuse and urban development in the country. Genuinely beautiful, genuinely well executed, and genuinely unaffordable for the majority of San Antonians who had lived near it before its transformation. The tension between San Antonio's identity as a tourist destination, built substantially on the marketing of its Mexican-American cultural heritage, its missions, its river walk, its fiesta, and its identity as a majority Mexican-American city with a significant poverty rate and persistent inequalities in education, housing, and economic opportunity, is one that the city's civic leaders have wrestled with for decades. The missions, which were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2015, are simultaneously a source of genuine community pride and a reminder of the colonial violence that created them. Fiesta, which generates hundreds of millions of dollars in economic activity each April, is simultaneously a genuine expression of community joy and a heavily commercialized event that has become increasingly disconnected from the working-class Mexican-American neighborhoods that provided its deepest cultural roots. Both cities, in the first decades of the 21st century, have been grappling with the politics of memory, with questions about which histories are honored, which monuments are preserved, which stories are told, and which are silenced. In New Orleans, the removal of 4 Confederate monuments in 2017, ordered by Mayor Mitch Landrieu, became a national flashpoint in the broader American debate about Confederate iconography and the uses of public space. Landrieu's speech explaining the removals, a speech that was widely circulated and widely praised, argued that the monuments were not, as their defenders claimed, simply historical markers, but were instead deliberate assertions of white supremacy, erected not in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, but decades later, during periods of intensified racial terror, as messages to Black New Orleanians about their place in the city. The removal of those monuments did not resolve the underlying questions they represented. The history they commemorated, the history of the Confederacy, of slavery, of the racial order that Reconstruction had tried and failed to dismantle, remains present in New Orleans in ways that go far beyond statuary. It is present in the inequalities of wealth and opportunity that still map almost perfectly onto the city's racial geography. It is present in the criminal justice system. It is present in the public schools. It is present in the neighborhoods that still bear the marks of Katrina 18 years later, where the recovery has been slowest and most incomplete. In San Antonio, the politics of memory have centered substantially on the Alamo, whose ownership and interpretation have been contested for years between the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, a heritage organization that controlled the site for over a century, and the state of Texas, which assumed control in 2015 and commissioned a major redesign of the Alamo complex and its museum. The redesign has been controversial precisely because it has attempted to tell a more complete story of the Alamo, one that includes the perspectives of the Tejano, the enslaved people, and the Mexican soldiers, not just the Anglo-Texan defenders whose story has dominated the popular mythology. That attempt at a more complete history has been vigorously resisted by those who see the traditional Alamo story as a sacred narrative that should not be complicated or qualified. These battles over memory and monument are not peripheral to the life of these cities. They are central to it, because the stories cities tell about themselves shape what they believe is possible, who they believe belongs, and what kind of future they are capable of imagining. A city that tells an honest story about its past, about the violence and the injustice alongside the beauty and the creativity, is a city that can engage honestly with the inequalities of its present. A city that protects a myth at the expense of the truth is a city that will keep recreating the conditions that produced the injustice in the first place. And so here we are, in the present tense, in these two extraordinary cities that have been so many things: French and Spanish and American, colonial and colonized, segregated and integrated, destroyed and rebuilt, mythologized and overlooked. And that remain, despite everything, among the most compelling and most irreplaceable urban cultures in the Western Hemisphere. New Orleans today is a city of roughly 380,000 people, smaller than it was before Katrina, still recovering in some neighborhoods, still producing music and food and art and community life of astonishing quality. Its challenges are real and serious. The criminal justice system, the public schools, the housing affordability crisis, the existential threat of climate change, and rising sea levels to a city that sits below sea level and is losing the coastal wetlands that once provided natural storm protection. But it is also a city where people choose every day to stay and to build and to make something beautiful out of circumstances that would defeat lesser communities. San Antonio today is a city of approximately 1.5 million people, one of the fastest growing cities in the United States, majority Hispanic, deeply Catholic, militarily significant, and still negotiating the terms of its own identity. Its challenges are also real: the poverty rate, the educational inequalities, the displacement pressures of rapid growth, the ongoing tension between development and community preservation. But it is also a city that has demonstrated, through cops and the civil rights movement and the political transformations of the past half-century, that communities can organize and demand and win, that the trajectory of a city is not fixed by its history, but can be altered by the determination of its people. Both cities, every year, celebrate the same inherited Catholic tradition in their own distinctive ways. The season of communal joy that Europe brought to the New World, and that the New World transformed into something far stranger and more wonderful than Europe had ever intended. Mardi Gras and Fiesta, Fat Tuesday and the Battle of Flowers, the bead and the cascarin, the second line and the mariachi, the king cake and the puffy taco. Different expressions of the same ancient impulse: to gather, to celebrate, to insist on joy in the face of everything that conspires against it. That impulse, that insistence, is what these two cities have in common at the deepest level. It is what their histories have made them. And it is what, if we are paying attention, they have to teach the rest of us about how to live in a world that is always more complicated, more painful, and more beautiful than any single story can contain. Every story needs a place to land, not an ending. Exactly, because the stories of living cities do not end. They simply continue in forms that the previous chapters could not have predicted, but a place where the threads that have been running through the narrative come together and reveal something about their essential nature. We are approaching that place now, in this final segment of our journey through two of the most extraordinary cities in the Americas. We have traveled a long way together. We have walked the streets of colonial New Orleans when it was still La Nouvelle Orleans, a precarious French settlement on a crescent of unstable ground above the Mississippi. We have stood in the shadow of the missions along the San Antonio River, hearing the bells that called indigenous converts to prayer in a language not their own. We have witnessed the political earthquakes of the 19th century, the Civil War and its aftermath, the rise and fall of Reconstruction, the long, brutal imposition of Jim Crow and its Mexican-American equivalent in South Texas. We have listened to the music, the jazz and the conjunto, the brass bands and the corridos, that these cities made from the raw material of their particular suffering and their particular joy. We have watched the civil rights movements that transformed their political landscapes. We have sat with the devastation of Katrina and the slower devastations of development and displacement. And now we arrive at the present, not as a destination, but as a vantage point, a place from which to look back at everything these cities have been and forward at everything they might still become. The food of these two cities deserves its own extended meditation, because food is the most intimate and the most democratic of cultural expressions, more accessible than architecture, more immediate than music, more daily and more necessary than any art form, and in both New Orleans and San Antonio, more historically layered than almost anything else you can put in your mouth. New Orleans cuisine is, in the estimation of many serious food scholars, the most complex regional cuisine in the United States, a system of cooking that synthesizes more cultural influences into more coherent and distinctive dishes than any other American culinary tradition. The French foundation is present in the roux, that careful cooking of flour and fat that is the basis of gumbo and étouffée and the city's entire approach to sauce making. The African contribution is present in the okra and the black-eyed peas and the rice, and the particular understanding of how to coax flavor from ingredients that more wasteful cuisines might discard. The whole fish, the pig's feet, the greens, the beans. The Spanish influence is present in the use of tomatoes, in the sofrito-adjacent base of the Holy Trinity, onion, celery, and bell pepper, the New Orleans answer to the French mirepoix, and in the rice dishes that echo the Caribbean. The indigenous contribution is present in the file powder, ground from dried sassafras leaves by Choctaw women who traded it in the French quarter market for generations, and in the crawfish and the game, and the particular knowledge of how to eat a landscape. The German influence is present in the sausage-making tradition. The Sicilian influence, brought by the enormous wave of Italian immigration in the late 19th century, is present in the muffuletta sandwich and the use of olive salad, and the particular way the city absorbed yet another immigrant community into its culinary DNA. What is most remarkable about New Orleans food is not any individual dish, but the coherence of the whole. The sense that all of these influences have been so thoroughly integrated over so many generations that the cuisine has its own internal logic, its own flavor profile, its own way of approaching the act of eating that is recognizable and consistent even as it encompasses enormous variety. A bowl of red beans and rice on a Monday, a plate of barbecue shrimp on a Tuesday, a muffuletta at lunch, and a bowl of turtle soup at dinner. These are all New Orleans food, all recognizably from the same place, all carrying the same DNA of a city that learned to make abundance from the convergence of cultures. The restaurant culture of New Orleans is inseparable from the city's social life in a way that is true almost nowhere else in America. The city's great restaurants, places like Dooky Chase's, which Leah Chase ran for decades as both a culinary institution and a gathering place for the civil rights movement, where Martin Luther King Jr. and Thurgood Marshall and Ray Charles came to eat and strategize, are not merely places to have a meal. They are community institutions, places where the city's social fabric is woven and maintained, where the rituals of hospitality that the city has inherited from its French and African and Creole traditions are performed with a seriousness and a warmth that turns eating into something closer to ceremony. Leah Chase herself, who continued cooking in her 90s and who passed away in 2019 at the age of 96, embodied the relationship between New Orleans food and New Orleans justice more completely than anyone else of her generation. A woman who fed the powerful and the powerless with equal care and who understood that the table was a place where a more equal world could be practiced, if not yet fully achieved. In San Antonio, the culinary tradition is equally complex and equally layered, though it has received significantly less national recognition than it deserves, a reflection, perhaps, of the broader tendency of American food culture to undervalue Mexican and Mexican-American cooking even as it enthusiastically consumes it. The cuisine of San Antonio is rooted in the cooking of northern Mexico and the Texas-Mexican borderlands, a tradition distinct from the interior Mexican cuisines that most Americans encounter, shaped by the particular ingredients and techniques of the Chihuahuan Desert and the South Texas brush country. Tex-Mex, which San Antonio can reasonably claim as its primary culinary contribution to the world, is one of the most misunderstood and undervalued of American regional cuisines. It is often described dismissively as a corruption of authentic Mexican food. Too much cheese, too much beef, too little sophistication. This characterization is both culinarily wrong and historically obtuse. Tex-Mex is not a corruption of anything. It is a fully developed regional cuisine with its own history, its own internal logic, and its own aesthetic, born from the particular circumstances of the Texas-Mexican borderlands over several centuries. The chili gravy that defines enchiladas in the San Antonio style, the crispy, puffy taco that is a San Antonio invention claimed by no other city, the breakfast taco that has become one of the defining foods of contemporary American urban breakfast culture. These are not compromises or simplifications, but genuine culinary achievements, expressions of a cooking tradition that has been developing for as long as New Orleans has been developing its own. The breakfast taco, in particular, is worth dwelling on, because it is a perfect example of how cultural meaning gets packed into the most apparently simple of foods. A flour tortilla, itself a product of the borderlands, where wheat from Spanish colonial agriculture met the indigenous tradition of flatbread cooking, filled with scrambled eggs, perhaps some potato, perhaps some chorizo, perhaps some beans and cheese, wrapped to be eaten in hand on the way to work. It is a working person's food, invented by, and for people whose mornings did not allow for the leisure of sit-down breakfast, and it carries in its simplicity the entire history of the Mexican-American working class in South Texas. The ranch hands, and the agricultural laborers, and the construction workers, and the domestic workers who built this city and fed this city, and were for so long excluded from its official story. The tortillerias of San Antonio's west side, some of them operating for generations in the same family, producing fresh tortillas every morning that supply restaurants and households across the city, are as much a part of the city's cultural infrastructure as any museum or concert hall. They are places where a daily act of production connects the present to the deep past of Mesoamerican corn culture, to the Spanish colonial introduction of wheat, to the borderland synthesis that produced the flour tortilla, to the specific hands of specific families who have kept the tradition alive through every economic and political upheaval the city has experienced. The relationship between these two cities and the natural environments they inhabit is one of the most important and most urgent dimensions of their contemporary story, because both cities are facing existential environmental challenges that are, at their root, the accumulated consequences of centuries of decisions about how to relate to the land and water that sustain them. New Orleans sits in a position of extraordinary environmental precariousness. The city is built on deltaic sediment that is constantly subsiding, sinking slowly but measurably into the soft ground beneath it. The Mississippi River, which built the delta over millennia by depositing sediment as it flooded each spring, was levied and controlled in the 20th century to protect agriculture and shipping. And the result is that the sediment that once replenished the delta now flows past it and out into the Gulf of Mexico. The coastal wetlands of Louisiana, which once provided a natural buffer against storm surge, are disappearing at a rate of roughly a football field every hour. A loss of land so rapid and so continuous that it registers as one of the fastest rates of coastal land loss anywhere on Earth. Climate change is accelerating sea level rise and intensifying the hurricanes that form in the warming waters of the Gulf. The combination of subsidence, wetland loss, sea level rise, and intensifying storms creates a threat to New Orleans that is not hypothetical or distant, but immediate and measurable. The people of New Orleans are not passive in the face of this threat. The city has invested in significant infrastructure improvements since Katrina, a new, improved levee and flood wall system that provides substantially better protection than the one that failed in 2005. Urban planners, landscape architects, and community organizations are developing innovative approaches to water management that work with the natural hydrology of the delta rather than against it, creating parks and green infrastructure that can absorb and store water, restoring wetlands along the city's edges, experimenting with allowing certain low-lying areas to return to a more natural relationship with water. The Dutch, who have been managing life below sea level for centuries, have become important partners and advisors in this work, bringing their hard-won expertise to a city that is confronting, in accelerated form, the challenge that the Netherlands has been navigating for generations. But the deeper question, whether New Orleans can survive as a city in its current location over the long term, given the pace of environmental change, is one that responsible scientists and planners are beginning to ask out loud, and it is a question that has no comfortable answer. The city has survived so much. It has been flooded and burned and occupied and neglected and partially destroyed and rebuilt. The possibility that it might ultimately be threatened not by any human enemy, but by the slow, implacable rise of the waters that surround it is one that the people of New Orleans are confronting with the same mixture of grief, determination, and dark humor that they have always brought to the most difficult questions. In San Antonio, the environmental challenge is different in character, but equally urgent. The city sits above the Edwards Aquifer, a vast underground reservoir of fresh water that is the primary water source for approximately 2 million people in the greater San Antonio region. The aquifer is fed by rainfall that percolates through the limestone of the hill country to the north and west, a recharge process that is slow and that is increasingly threatened by the impervious surfaces of suburban development spreading across the recharge zone. The aquifer also supports a unique ecosystem of springs and surface waterways, including the San Marcos Springs and Barton Springs in Austin, which are home to several species found nowhere else on Earth. The fountain darter, the Texas blind salamander, the San Marcos salamander, species that have evolved over millions of years in the specific chemistry of these spring-fed waters and that cannot survive anywhere else. The management of the Edwards Aquifer has been one of the most contentious environmental and political issues in Texas for decades, involving conflicts between urban water users, agricultural users, environmental advocates, and the fish and wildlife that depend on the springs maintaining minimum flow levels. The aquifer authority that manages the resource has implemented pumping limits and conservation programs that have had genuine positive effects. But the fundamental tension between the water demands of a rapidly growing city and the finite capacity of the aquifer remains unresolved and will only intensify as the region's population continues to grow and climate change alters the rainfall patterns that recharge the system. The spiritual life of both cities in the contemporary moment reflects the full complexity of their histories. The layers of faith that have accumulated over 3 centuries of colonial encounter, cultural synthesis, and community survival. Catholicism remains the dominant religious tradition in both cities, but it is a Catholicism that has been shaped by its particular environments into something that would be recognizable, but also perhaps surprising to a visitor from Rome. In New Orleans, the Catholic tradition exists alongside and in deep relationship with the African spiritual traditions that were never fully displaced by missionary Christianity. The Vodou tradition, which was practiced in New Orleans from the earliest days of the African diaspora, and which reached its most publicly visible expression in the 19th century through figures like Marie Laveau, the legendary voodoo queen of New Orleans, a free woman of color who was also a devout Catholic and who conducted her spiritual practice in a synthesis of both traditions that reflected the city's broader cultural logic, continues to be practiced in the city today, largely outside of public view, but present and alive in the community's spiritual life. The cemetery tradition of New Orleans, with its above-ground tombs necessitated by the high water table, its elaborate decoration on All Saints' Day, its persistent connection between the living and the dead, is one of the most visible expressions of this synthesis. A Catholic practice inflected by African and Caribbean understandings of the relationship between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors. In San Antonio, the Catholic tradition has been most powerfully shaped by Mexican and Mexican-American devotional practice, by the veneration of the Virgin of Guadalupe, whose image appears throughout the city's public and private spaces, in murals on building walls, and on the dashboards of trucks, and in the tattoos on people's arms, as a constant visual reminder of a faith that is simultaneously theological and deeply, personally cultural. The annual celebration of the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe on December 12th fills the city's Catholic churches to overflowing and spills out into the streets in processions and music, and the particular atmosphere of communal devotion that Mexican Catholic culture has always been extraordinarily good at creating. The Quinceañera, the celebration of a young woman's 15th birthday that marks her transition from childhood to womanhood, is one of the most important cultural and religious events in the life of San Antonio's Mexican-American community, a tradition that combines Catholic Mass with elaborate secular celebration, that mobilizes extended family networks and requires months of planning and significant financial investment, and that functions as an assertion of cultural identity and community, values that goes far beyond any single family's particular expression of it. Every quinceañera in San Antonio is, in some sense, a statement about who this community is and what it values and what it is passing on to the next generation, a living transmission of cultural memory dressed in a formal gown. As we come to the close of this journey, I want to return to the thing that brought these two cities together in the first place, that shared calendar, that common inheritance of Catholic European celebration, the Mardi Gras, and the fiesta that both cities have made entirely their own. When the people of New Orleans gather in the streets on Fat Tuesday, when the Mardi Gras Indians appear in their magnificent hand-sewn suits, when the second lines dance through the neighborhoods, when the Crews roll their floats down St. Charles Avenue, and the crowds reach for the beads and the doubloons and the stuffed animals thrown from above, they are participating in a tradition that connects them to the French colonial world that founded their city more than 300 years ago. But they are also participating in something that is entirely and irreducibly theirs. A tradition so thoroughly transformed by the African and Creole and Caribbean and American influences that have shaped the city that it bears only the most distant family resemblance to the European carnival from which it descended. It is New Orleans, all the way down. When the people of San Antonio gather for fiesta in April, when the cascarones are cracked over heads and the confetti flies, when the mariachis play in the plazas and the smell of elotes and churros and barbacoa fills the air, when the Battle of Flowers parade rolls through downtown and the fiesta royalty appears in their elaborate gowns, when the West Side comes alive with the particular energy of a community that has been celebrating this season since before the city was officially American. They are participating in a tradition that connects them to the Spanish Catholic world that built their missions and their civic culture 3 centuries ago. And they are also participating in something entirely their own, a celebration so thoroughly shaped by the Mexican-American and Tejano and multicultural identity of San Antonio that its European origins are present only as the faintest background note beneath the vibrant, insistent, joyful sound of the city as it actually is. Both celebrations are, at their deepest level, acts of resilience. They are the refusal of communities that have survived conquest and slavery and dispossession and flood and discrimination and displacement to stop making joy. They are the insistence, repeated every year without fail, that beauty is not a luxury but a necessity, that the human capacity for celebration is not separate from the human capacity for survival, but is, in fact, one of its most important expressions. These 2 cities have so much still to navigate. The climate will continue to challenge New Orleans in ways that will test the city's survival at the most fundamental level. The pressures of growth and development will continue to challenge San Antonio's ability to remain a city that belongs to all of its people. The inequalities that were built into both cities during the colonial period deepened during the era of Jim Crow and systematic dispossession, and that have never been fully addressed, will continue to demand attention and action and justice. But these cities have navigated the impossible before. They have survived empires and plagues and fires and floods and wars and political betrayals of almost every conceivable kind. And they have survived not merely as geographical locations, but as living cultures, as communities of people who know who they are, where they come from, how to feed each other, and make music for each other, and mourn each other, and celebrate each other in the specific, irreplaceable ways that their long, complicated, beautiful, painful histories have taught them. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, almost everything. There is a city on a river in the south, draped in iron lace, where the music never entirely stops and the dead are buried above ground, and the food carries the memory of a dozen civilizations in every bite. There is a city on a limestone plateau in the southwest, wrapped in the sound of accordion and bajo sexto, where the missions still stand along their river, and the quinceañeras fill the churches every weekend, and the breakfast tacos are the most honest thing you will eat all day. They were founded in the same year. They were shaped by the same competing empires. They inherited the same Catholic calendar and made it entirely their own. They were absorbed into the same American nation and refused to be dissolved by it. They have produced from the raw material of conquest and survival and the irrepressible human need to make something beautiful, 2 of the most distinctive and most deeply rooted urban cultures in the Western Hemisphere. And every year, when the season turns and the celebrations begin, in February in New Orleans, in April in San Antonio, the 2 cities are, without quite knowing it, speaking to each other across 500 miles of Gulf Coast and brush country and bayou, in the shared language of people who have learned, over 3 centuries, that joy is not the opposite of history. It is what history, at its best, is for. This concludes our journey through the history of San Antonio, Texas, and New Orleans, Louisiana. If you're looking for resources to help you relax and fall asleep better naturally, be sure to check out the link in the description below. Don't forget to like this video, and be sure and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you know when the next journey through history is ready to embark on. Thank you again, and have a good night.